Welcome to episode 24. Check out what we have in store for you this week. One of my favorite TV shows right now. It's perfection in TV form.
I'm a map. Isn't that like two things for? Is it I'm a map? I'm the map.
I don't know, but
I don't know.
You just like, I'm usually the one that sings, and so you just started. And I was like,
I don't do it very often.
That's perfect. In the context of a classroom, it's the safest place for you and students to learn about the hardest subjects. That's right, we're back. It's another week of the High Tech Podcast. It is Will here with Josh. You here with me?
Hello, I am here.
We have a check and a check, and everything is good to go. This is episode 24. Can you believe it?
24 episodes.
We just started off with the idea like we could do this, right? And it's like almost.
Who would have known I would live this long? You know?
Well, frankly, our life expectancy has gone up since we've had these conversations around our wives less.
Yes, that's
There's
true.
A direct correlation.
That is very true. They get to hang out with each other too.
Yeah.
They're like little powwows.
I'm expecting that at least once I've missed them in the editing and they've come through on the microphone. Like people have heard them downstairs or in your place, like making laughs, making jokes.
Yeah, whatever they're doing.
They're gonna be happy to be referenced in this episode again.
Yeah, they will be. Yeah. If my wife will definitely at least hear this at some point. I don't know if yours will ever start listening, but
she's not a fan. She's just I get it. It's fine. She might listen to episode 19.
She's probably gonna listen to this one, and then I'm gonna be in trouble.
Exactly.
So yeah. So if you're listening, I'm sorry.
It's all good. It's all fine. So this week we wanted to start things out with a pretty simple question to ourselves. What was your first cross-cultural experience? Now, of course, this could just be something down the street, but I think Josh and I are more thinking like international or big picture.
I guess technically, down the street was my friend's house, and
Anvil,
really,
not much going on there.
Cross-cultural.
Yeah.
It was like, oh, you also eat hamburgers. Okay.
Cool.
Like that was it. That was the thing. We're thinking out of the country. I guess technically out of state could be a little bit cross-cultural. We live in the city. In our area, going down the street could be cross-cultural. It depends. But I do think we're thinking kind of out of the country. So I'll let you go with this one first, buddy. Your first cross-cultural
experience. Well done. Yes, you got it. All of that came out. I was 11 years old. I went to the country of Haiti. It was my first time. We went 3 times overall, each time for almost 2 weeks. I think one was just a little bit over 2 weeks, but we were there to build orphanages, work on orphanages. And I'll tell you, as an 11-year-old, I remember one of the first questions I was asking my parents when we were preparing to go is like, can I take my Game Boy? Like, can you imagine, right? Yeah. And I did not end up taking it, of course, but it's like that was my perspective as an 11-year-old heading to Haiti. Yeah. And afterwards I was like, but why don't these people have food?
Why don't they have Game Boy?
Can I sell my Game Boy and help them? What do I have to do? I'll send all my shirts. And a very impactful experience though. I mean, I don't know that everybody at 11 years old is getting kind of hit with the crushing reality of poverty and
that's like a natural thing at 11.
I was a little slow, wasn't I? Wasn't it like 9?
Yeah, it's at 10 you experience new foods for the first time. At 11 you experience the crushing reality of poverty. At 12 you experience the crushing reality of losing a pet. I don't know.
Too soon. I think that would have been perfect actually for when my first dog got run over.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well done. But, I think there's just a lot in those experiences that stands out to me is what it shaped my perspective as a person. And I was pretty young, of course, but it really did give me some life lessons that stood with me. And I do remember sending down some shirts and stuff like that to be shared at the orphanages and going down one of the 3 times and seeing a kid like wearing one of the shirts and really being impacted by the fact of like, folks, there are a lot of small things we can do out there, and there are a lot of big things we can do out there, and both are worth doing. You got $1 million, donate it to something. But if you have a T-shirt or a cup to donate, it's also still going to help someone. So it just really stood out to me at 11 years old, and some of those lessons I think even impact me today. What about you?
Okay. So I we gotta be honest, guys. We knew how this was gonna go. Mine was also Haiti. I did not go with Will. Okay, I went much later actually. So I did not do a lot of I did not go out of the country really much until I was 18. No, I traveled a ton. I was in a band, so I traveled a lot of different states in the U.S. and things like that. And we almost tried to tour in the Philippines once. So, but that didn't actually happen. So I never went out of the country before then. So my dad helped with an organization also that had a specific orphanage they ran down there. That he had been down there several times. So actually my wife, who was just my girlfriend at the time, and I went down with a group of people and my dad. Similar stuff. I had come face to face with more poverty stuff before then. It's turning into a poverty conversation, but, so that wasn't necessarily earth shattering for me when I got there. I think it was just it was a new experience for me being in just a completely different culture.
Yeah.
You'll remember this. I just remember getting off the plane into the airport, and I use airport loosely. And it was just it was a totally different experience. It was a garage that I come off, and people holding fully automatic weapons, and it was just a completely different experience, but wonderful people there. There was a guy who kind of helped run the orphanage and some things that we stayed with, and then we basically just hung out with the kids a lot and played with them and kind of just chilled and did some stuff. And while we were there, a couple of us went out to on trips to get stuff for the orphanage, because we were sponsors of the orphanage. So they would send groups down every so often from the company that ran it, the organization, nonprofit, so that people could check in and see how things were going and make sure, essentially, hand money, because Haiti's not known for its
no, you don't send money
situations. So you'd go down, get stuff. I still remember, I think one of my favorite experiences were sitting in a truck, and this guy comes up to us with a whole bunch of knives to this guy and me that are sitting in the truck. And he tries to sell us these knives. And he's Haitian, clearly Haitian, but he can speak English. But he's trying to convince us to he's from Colorado. And trying to sell us knives. We're dude, you are not from Colorado. No, you're not.
Nice try.
So, I think the thing that stands out to me the most was just just completely different society. Haiti's been very hurt by a lot of things. And it was definitely one of my first experiences in a while, up until I went to Israel and a couple other places, where I really was in a place where everybody spoke a different language than I did.
You were the minority. You were the outsider.
Yes, yeah. And there were moments that they were clearly laughing at my lame whiteness. Which was totally fine. It was the first experience, being with a bunch of Haitian kids.
Yeah.
If I did something stupid, I didn't necessarily know I did something stupid, other than I knew that they were probably laughing at me, but I don't know why.
And you just had to laugh and roll with it.
To laugh with them, and they were great kids.
Yeah.
So it was a cool experience.
Haiti was actually too my first time meeting people, significantly that spoke more than one language. I didn't grow up in an area that people spoke by two languages. So almost all the Haitians we connected with, unless they were really young, or really old, spoke English and or Creole. But then I also got to meet somebody there who was a part of the hotel that we were staying at and stuff. He spoke 4 languages, and it was just so amazing amidst all of it to meet these people who could speak all these languages. And I was bummed, that in the United States context, you take a class of French, you take a class of Spanish, you never get to any sort of functional fluency. So I don't know. I think that there's a lot of good opportunities there in the cross-cultural experiences. I know that growing up, my dad used to say that he wished that cross-cultural experiences be a part of high school graduation, or at least college graduation. Everybody should do it. It is really valuable. And I know that even a lot of the perspectives and opinions I hold today about people in the States, people, in the global context, are informed by the fact that I grew up knowing that I wasn't the only majority, right? Here I am a majority. Absolutely. I fit into the stereotype or the demographic for what is the major people population in the United States. But in Haiti, I was a minority. And in different places I've been in the world, even if it's not about skin color or whatever, like if you just don't speak the language, or if you're not a part of the culture, if you don't know what it is to be kind of native to these places, you are the outsider. And it's really, I think, important to have those experiences to humble yourself to know what other people who in the minority contexts and are being hurt in the minority context are experiencing.
Yeah. You could almost say it helps us learn how to include people better, you know? Like being in a experience where we feel like the excluded, the outsider, helps us understand how to bring people in.
Absolutely.
How to include them better.
Not to belittle it, right? It's not like we're not trying to like reduce this to something too simple, but a practice of being more inclusive and creating, in our case today, a more inclusive classroom. A practice in that is first experiencing what it is to be outside, knowing what it is to like see the other side's perspective, and just know that you want to be able to read things in your own language. You want to be able to speak to people who sound like you. You want to be able to hang out with people who look like you. Like that's valuable on so many levels culturally. And I think that the inclusive classroom, we're pivoting here into the kind of the main topic for today, but the inclusive classroom doesn't need to be representative of just the body of students you have, right? The inclusive classroom does not mean if all of your students are one demographic, then an inclusive classroom is teaching them what it is to be about themselves. I don't think that that's necessarily what we're trying to say inclusivity is, right? Like, but if you have a homogenous group where you have students who are all very similar, it's really still important to identify what differences there are in those students and advise them of what more there is out there beyond themselves. Because in the context of a classroom, it's the safest place for you and students to learn about the hardest subjects, right? Yeah. It's a place for good thought, free thought, the opportunity to ask hard questions and work through important things. And so in an inclusive classroom, we want to make sure that we want to advocate today that if students need, help because of disabilities, if students need help because of second languages, if students need help because of cultural differences, if it does come down to poverty and class issues, like there's so much that goes into making a classroom inclusive that I think we want to make sure we find some good ideas and advocate for those today and how you can be doing that in your classroom. Yeah.
Now I'll throw out this preface, guys, as we talk about this, because obviously, like, unless you didn't read the title and you just clicked on the episode, which if you did, hats off to you. You like us enough you didn't even read what we were talking
about.
Well
done.
That's
golf
well
clap.
done.
Golf clap.
Golf clap. Obviously we're talking about like how to foster an inclusive classroom, right? Now we're gonna be talking about this from both a digital and physical classroom standpoint. I think the name title of this said episode sometimes leads you to believe just like the in-classroom experience, but I think there's places to talk about both of them. I will throw out this preface. We are just two people who are coming at this from a certain angle. There are a lot of different angles that this could be come at from. I'm sure there's things we're not going to be talking about. I'm sure there are things we're missing. We're not including people perfectly in our inclusive classroom conversation. So just, deal with us, work with us, and feel free to toss out ideas of things that, we didn't cover in this episode, because we only allow ourselves like 30-40 minutes, so obviously
can't capture
we got a whole app to show you too, so we don't have time to get through everything,
but we're also honest and humble enough to be challenged. So if it's not just something where you think that we've omitted something you wish we would have talked about, or you feel like we missed the mark on something, let us know. We're genuine about this. We care. We want to see ourselves improve. We want to see others improve. So
we're just figuring this out like everybody else. So I think it's this is coming out from a certain direction, but let's take those directions. So let's talk about a couple different of our spaces. So I think there are two spaces that you and I have kind of landed on, and when we have this conversation, usually we're talking about how to foster an inclusive classroom. I think the immediate reaction is in-classroom experience. Okay, right. How do we create this inclusive classroom? The problem is there's a whole nother realm that we often deal with in high tech a lot as well, obviously, which is this digital classroom online space. And there are ways to create that place. There are inclusive digital courses. There are courses that are not inclusive. Yep. So how do we make that space look, how do we foster inclusivity in there? I think let's deal with that first. Let's deal with the digital first. And we'll talk about the in-classroom experience here in a second.
Ironically, my experiences in the digital classroom, or just the digital kind of melting pot experience, started when I was about 13. I was working on a couple of different websites at that time with people who were in New York, London, West Coast, Midwest in the United States.
Ooh, fancy.
And I just remember that for a 13-year-old being interesting, like to wrestle with different perspectives, different desires, who's coming from which angle or not. One of my favorite TV shows right now, Ted Lasso. It's just, it's perfection in TV form. It does a really good job of acknowledging what a lot of people see as stereotypes in personality and peoples across groups. But in this one episode, somebody comes up to him, another player, and says something fairly curt, and the response is, it's okay, he's not trying to be offensive, he's just Dutch. Now, again, that is a stereotype, that is an oversimplification, but what the moment tried to go for is that this person wasn't trying to be mean, this person was being honest and direct, and there was no malintent behind it. So something that you can see there in a physical context is people can talk, read body language, whatever, but that stuff happens online all the time.
Yes.
And just go to the discussion forum. We've talked about the discussion forum plenty of times, right? But if you can imagine, as Josh has at his institution, I've experienced it there, and I've experienced it at my other institutions. If you put national and international people in the same discussion forum, there's going to be miscommunications. There's going to be people.
No.
Not just like,
ridiculous.
Oh, I don't like your idea. And then it gets, a little harried. Like, if you got people who are in urban cultures versus rural cultures in the same course, they're going to have different perspectives. I remember seeing a discussion forum in one of the courses at Josh's institution when I worked there, where somebody broke out into a pretty deep debate about Republican Democrat. Just that. And it had nothing to do in the end with the topic of the content.
Who would have thought that would break out a hot topic conversation?
Yep. But
we're really so civil about those things.
It was definitely across those constituents. We had some urban students working in classes with rural students, and they were representative of their political stances, and it became difficult to work with that. So now the instructor would normally see that stuff happen in the physical classroom. This is kind of us speaking again to why the digital needs to be thought of in this inclusive spaces. The instructor's not there immediately when that starts to happen. Mm-hmm. The instructor might not come back until that debate is done and people have effed each other and cussed each other and this to each other. You know what I mean? Like we can stop that in a classroom, but online you have to be wary of your prompts and your assignments that could cultivate those kinds of situations.
So I think this brings me to a first takeaway, right? That now we're not going to have let me preface this. When we talk about digital inclusivity, when we talk about like online classrooms, and we keep calling them online classrooms, but I mean like online courses, online spaces, right? That you're working on. Guys, there are a million ways we could deal with this inclusivity. So we're not going to get on all of these topics. We don't have the time, but I think one that's a very easy thing is just thinking through things we recommend to instructors all the time and things that we do when we set up our online courses in our space is if you're going to have stuff like discussions, right? Or student interaction, setting guidelines ahead of time for what that student interaction should look like, and being clear about it, kind of having agreed, I think classroom, you would do this in classroom. So like, I think like agreed course kind of policies and conduct for how we're going to etiquette of how we're going to deal with discussions. That of itself is going to at least set you some grounds to have a conversation or, post an announcement or something in that situation where things maybe got out of hand, just to say, hey guys, remember, we want to, these types of conversations, but having that preface to also kind of get that in the minds of your students. And I think, replicating that as an instructor, taking time to, hear out other ideas and opinions and not just like shutting down a student in a discussion, unless they're like being way out of line. Right. But I've seen so many times an instructor who maybe doesn't agree with the student's post and just like tears that student apart in front of every single student on that discussion. And it's like, you wouldn't do that in the classroom. Don't do that in the digital space.
Hopefully.
Like hopefully, maybe you do. And then we will have that conversation here in a second. We talk about in classrooms, but, Like so I just think that like guidelines and displaying a lot of an online classroom for me, online courses comes down to use the instructor displaying what you expect the students to do when they're in the courses. And I think a discussion space is a perfect example of that. Is displaying that to the students and having conduct ahead of time so that you can use that to address issues that come up inside your discussions.
Another digital thing, practice. Here's another, takeaway number 2. When you are dealing with these systems, so many of them are fed by databases on databases on databases. So you get into your learning management system for the first time, instructor. You log into your course, you see your roster, and you look at John, Bill, Susie, Priya, and Siddharth, and you've got
Batman. Sorry.
Batman. You've got all these names in there. You take it as the Bible. You take it as like that's fact, right? Every name that you see is legitimate, and every institution is different about this. So I would just encourage you, you know at your institution if these names are accurate and correct or not. But today we also want to be sensitive to the fact that there are people who are regularly, for more than one reason, changing their names legally, right, and taking on different persona. And that is them. That is their journey. That is beautiful. That is a representative of who they are, want to be. And I think that it's an easy practice in digital classrooms to do something in week 1 where you ask the students to introduce themselves by their preferred names.
Yeah.
Just that, and then use it. You don't need to cloud that with any political statements. You don't even ask them why they go by whatever name they go by. They are welcome to disclose that, right? Yeah. But I know someone in my community whose first name legally is something traditional, and they go by a name that is just a noun of an object in the world. I'm like, hey, cool. There's no reason why. This person isn't identified explicitly as transgender. This person isn't identified explicitly as, trying to hide from their family or some sort of upset background. That's just their choice. They've chosen to go by this separate name, and I'm going to respect that. And it's very easy in a digital context where all these names are fed to you from their legal names, which aren't easy to change in these systems. Josh and I, trust us, we know. We wish we could make them more effective.
I get regular complaints about it. It's not...
We both know how to fix it, too.
People think it is, yeah. We know how to fix it, but
we can't.
It's not perfect. No, yeah, like I think to your point, like if we're talking about just like you're teaching an online class or you're working on it, think through where do you have students introduce themselves? It may seem like a small thing, but like for instance, in us, our program stuff we set up, we always have an introduction discussion in our online courses. And we allow students to either like post a video about themselves or write about themselves. But the goal is to introduce themselves, and it's in that space that you can use that they can introduce. Trust me, if their name is not what it's supposed to be in the LMS, if you allow them to introduce themselves with their name, they will tell you that it is something different.
Yeah.
And so like, just give them that space to do that. And even that introductions also sets up a bunch of other things, just so like people can know the other students, because that online space is very easy for us to kind of give inhuman profile pictures to each other's face, like to who they are, and not actually think of them as a person. And so I think that introduction discussion, whatever it may be, with each other is just a good way to kind of like pay attention to that as an instructor. Don't have them do an introduction discussion and not look at the stuff that they put in the introduction. It's a minor thing, but please go watch all of them, because there will be, or read them or whatever you do, so that you would do that in a regular first day of class. Do it in an online format too. I think that kind of helps resolve some of these issues we're talking about.
It's also so low stakes. It doesn't cost you time, energy. It's easy. Now in the physical classroom, there's definitely spaces where inclusivity can be as important as critical right now as conversations on racism and conversations on understanding the world as we're dealing with and responding to COVID-19 and everything that's been happening in the United States with the election cycles. Like, very important, absolutely. However, there's also very simple things that we can do in the classroom that help to manage equity and equality of cultures without having to touch the hot button items, right? Mm-hmm. Encouraging students to take on a practice whether it's raising hands or what, right? Because raising hands isn't exclusively the best method, but making a system so that students can make sure that they do something to get into the conversation and have the right to join the conversation, empower them to ask questions or to speak up in class. It's also, I think an important thing to make sure that when you are responding to that, so if you say, students, please raise your hands to ask a question, okay, that's your practice, you need to be sensitive to the fact of calling on more people in general, even if there's not that many hands going up. Like, I remember being in a classroom at a very large university in a class of about 45 students, STEM related, where the instructor asked a lot of questions, and the students actually consistently responded to the questions, which was great, but it was almost exclusively the male students. And it's just observation, right? I mean, that's where I was in that classroom that day, but this is a STEM field. There was a pretty good split of genders in the room, but the instructor almost only called on the male students, and it was stunning to watch it. You hope and you feel like this is not built on a bias or a prejudice, but it's the truth that when we naturally respond to the first person who raises the hand, that's a selection bias, because the first person to raise their hand is someone who's motivated to raise it in the first place. And so we have to be wary of the introverts, the people who are not as high functioning, and the people who just maybe physically raise their hand slower.
Yeah, I think what you're getting at is something that we talked about before this, which is when we're talking about the in-classroom issues, one of the things I think is a simple thing to take on is using different practices for taking feedback from students.
Oh yeah.
Like I've had instructors who almost universally their only way of doing it is I speak, hands raised, I speak, hands raised, and it's always like the same people, okay? And I was one of those obnoxious human beings. I was one that always had some kind of comment. But there's a lot of people who don't, right? Yeah. That don't do that. And so it's to think through different activities that can get people talking. Because there are definitely places where, I agree with you, Will, where it's like, have a standard for how you're going to take things from students during those times where you're just kind of freely taking comments from students, but also have those group activities where students can be forced to interact with each other. Yeah. Or feel like there is a sort of the stigma where like we don't want to call on students sometimes. I feel like we're putting them on the spot. But I don't think you're doing that if you give them time to deal with the question. If you give them time to think about it. Like, I'm going to feel less awkward asking you out of nowhere to give me an answer if I gave you like 5 minutes, 10 minutes to think about my question and write down some ideas. So like, think about that. Like, how do you get people who, like, one thing I always struggle with is I hate being called on because I hate being asked a question and not having time to actually think about the answer. Like, it's not because I wouldn't give you a good answer. It's just because like, I don't like to have to think on the spot, about what I'm going to tell you. Yeah, I want time to prepare. So think about that. Vary that in the classroom, I think. Now, real quick before we jump too far off of online, I do want to mention one other thing, and then I want to come back to in-classroom stuff just real quick. Is that the only other thing I would throw out is think about, for online, for inclusivity, the other thing I think a lot of people don't think about is what resources and things they're providing to their students. Ooh, so, like, we talk about accessibility a lot, and we have to deal with it in our space. But the amount of times I've had instructors just kind of like throw up a PDF or throw up a document without actually thinking about whether all students could access that thing. Yep. Now granted, in our instance, we have a lot less of like a student population that we need to deal with a lot of accessibility issues, but it's growing and it's always an issue, and we should be careful to think about that. So think about, can a student use this resource? Can somebody who maybe would have vision issues see what I'm giving them, or use a tool to be able to hear it? Is it readable, as we talk about, which we know a tool that Free does OCR, which helps with that.
Perusal, anyway, what?
Perusal.
Well, and Josh, one of those things that's so important, I think, accessibility is appropriately kind of immediately takes us to disabilities and ADA and Section 504, stuff like that. But a standard of access is really important for just PDFs for students across economic contexts. Like, I don't personally own a subscription to Adobe, right? Like, I can download DC, which is the free one, but it doesn't do a whole lot for me. It's not a lot of great features. I might only have a tablet. I might only have a MacBook. Ugh, what a tough life that would be, right? But like, like people have different software, and something that you need to be sensitive to. Like, if you can, I think as an instructor, your material should be available to the students directly in the LMS. So the LMS is the one doing the work, and they don't need another tool to load the materials for you. Or, if you've got a content system like Google Drive or Office 365 or whatever with OneDrive, like put the materials in those platforms, because those platforms just a link and that'll open on anything. And so there's those kinds of things, like from readability and accessibility at like a technical level to just like making it easy for your students across context to get your materials. Very important. And it's a practice of inclusivity, because if you put if you required all your students to access your course materials on Netflix, for instance, not all your students can pay for Netflix.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
we've had that issue.
Yeah, we've had that issue. Somebody listening to this is going to be like, who does that? It happens.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
The amount of times I've seen people be like, go to Netflix, start an account, watch this video. It's like, not everybody has everybody has the ability to do that.
Because Netflix requires a subscription. If you do the trial, that's fine, but it still requires data. Some students only do their work on their phones and mobile data, and data might not be consistent. They might be sharing data with 6 other family members in the house and can't stream a movie. Like, you just don't know.
Again, I think the whole point is just if I'd encourage, like, we have a whole office that does this for our online courses, but I know there's a lot of people who aren't in this situation. So it's to think through, what is the best way to get this to my students so that they can use it, and so everybody can have equal opportunity to the resources and things I'm providing. And it's a student first mentality instead of a what's the easiest solution for me in the course. And I know instructors don't always come in with that intention, but sometimes we do kind of fall into that without realizing it. We're kind of like, okay, throw up this resource, throw up this, we'll do this, because it's easier for me to just pull whatever I have on my computer and put it in, instead of carefully thinking through, if all my students came here, are all of them going to have the equal ability to access this? Now, some of your institutions may set standards for what students should have technology-wise, and that's great. Then you use those as kind of your base. But if you don't, I think you have to work from that. But I don't want to get too far into that. I think there's a lot of areas we could go in that space. So
here's a quick encouragement / consolation as we're dealing with this. Josh and I have worked with dozens, maybe at least 200, 300 different faculty. I don't know. We've probably worked with hundreds of different faculty.
Yeah, we've worked with a lot of different people
in our careers to date. I will tell you, I think I've met one bad guy. I think I've met one person in all those people who literally is just like, I don't care. You can't make me. So none of what we're trying to say is pointing the finger at the majority of instructors. We know you care. We know you want to do this. Yeah. I think this is one of those things where if you take some of these simple practices, you can just make the learning experience so much better for all of your students. And that's really a universal design for learning principle. But what my quick metaphor is, you're not bad guys. You're not the villains, right? But don't be a henchman, right? You don't need to be accidentally
that's good.
or incidentally being a part of the problem, when we can do some pretty easy things to be a part of the solution. Now, what I would like to say is, across all of this, to find the best solution, we really need to make sure we have a map. If you want to get to where you're going.
I'm a map. Isn't that like Tour the Explorer? Is it I'm a map? I'm the map. I don't know, but
I don't know. You just I'm usually the one that sings, and so you just started.
I don't do it very often.
That's perfect.
It's my favorite show.
No, I think that it's important. Like, we're trying to give you takeaways and ideas for how you can be, generate a more inclusive classroom through simple practices, stuff you can do tomorrow. But it oftentimes requires a little bit of intentionality, some reflection,
some direction.
And what better map to use than equity maps, right? Our tool today is an Apple iPad app. So there's our first limitation. It is only on iPad last time I used it. I don't know if that's been updated or not.
That is still true. I double-checked it before we did the episode. Cool. And I only thought now that we're talking about a tool that should be inclusive for all people, and it's only Apple. So equity maps. Get with the program.
Yeah, get equitable.
Get equitable.
Why I really care about this tool and wanted to put it up regardless of limitations, is that one of the things that's really important as we deal with inclusivity, as we deal with equity, this moment in time is really important for everyone to be working on diversity, equity, inclusion, but we don't always know how to start. And it's not very easy to identify where the problems are. It takes a lot of reflection. Yeah. And frankly, as we said at the beginning of this episode, Josh and I didn't know much and still can't say we know too much about other cultures, but going into another culture did help us gain perspective. Well, a tool like Equity Maps can really help you gain some perspective on your classroom. It's not the end tool. It's not the only tool. If you can find another one, great. But in practice, it lets you create a visual map on your iPad, on the app itself, of your classroom, of your students. And as you hold a discussion, right, it's actually intended to be done through like roundtable discussions or specifically a Socratic seminar style discussion. You are supposed to map out everyone who's a participant. And as you talk, either the instructor or a third party should be monitoring who talks and who they talk to, and use the app to track it all. And so by the end of the discussion, the Equity Maps gives you a report on how many times John spoke, and how many times Sarah spoke, and how many times Josh spoke to Will, and how many times Will spoke to Sarah, right? This is stuff that naturally happens and frankly is insignificant until you track it and you reflect on it and notice that Timothy never spoke, and Priya spoke once and was immediately interrupted by John, right? These are things that start to highlight for us what could be happening in the dynamic experience of the classroom, and can maybe help us identify people to empower and highlight their voices, and other people to help curtail and redirect their voices to create a more equitable space for ideas and the exchange of ideas.
Yeah, and as you're doing it here, like I have a visual up on my other screen of the tool, and so like what it's showing essentially, and I know, Will, you have a little bit more experience with it than I do, but it's a fairly simple concept, which is that, like, you know, we have a group of people up here, and as they're talking, you're doing this, and it's showing lines of connection between those people, and what'll start to show up, right, is like Will said, Will and Josh are talking a lot. There's going to be dark lines going between them a ton, as opposed to Sarah or, Batman, who are not talking a lot with each other.
Right.
Because Batman's a loner and a superhero, and Sarah doesn't like to talk to people dressed like bats.
He's not even in the circle.
Yeah, he's not even in the circle. He's in the dark. But anyway, but seriously, so to show you that kind of conversation, because I think it's easy in a classroom to lose track of who's talking more than others. I think to your comment about the instructor who was calling on guys more often than women, it's not necessarily that he was doing that on purpose. It might have been he wasn't thinking about it, and it was like just a reaction for him. It might have been those people raise their hands faster. You don't know. The reality, though, is that like a tool like Equity Maps, it's simple. You just pull it up. Like to your point, like you can do it or somebody else in the classroom can do it. It just, I think, is an aid for you for two reasons. One, during the conversation, to be actively paying attention to who's not talking as much, and not use it as like a punishment tool to be like,
absolutely,
oh, you person, you are not talking a lot. How dare you? But actually, to your point, empowering them to talk more, right? Empowering them to engage in the conversation. And so you can use that tool to be like, oh, well, okay, Sarah's not talking a lot. Sarah, what do you think about this? What do you think about what Dave said? Dave is a new person that just joined the class, if you guys aren't following. So like,
welcome, Dave.
What did Dave say? Yeah, welcome, Dave. What do you think about that? And to start to bring those people in. The other thing that I think I love about the idea of an Equity Map tool is it's good, like you said, Will, for after class. To also, over time, evaluate who is not engaging as much. And you have a line in our notes when we're talking about this stuff, but this idea of inviting our students back in with engagement practices. So you can use a tool like Equity Maps to see who's not engaging and think about, okay, what practices can I bring into the classroom to get Sarah and Dan to engage more? Okay, maybe it would help if Dan stopped showing up to class late. Like stuff like that.
Dan, right? Oh my
gosh, Dan, what a jerk.
No, but I think that the point you're getting to is phenomenal, and it really synthesizes a good bit of what we've suggested so far this episode. Like, if you use Equity Maps, you determine there's a deficiency in the social practices in your team, so certain people aren't speaking to other people, whatever the issue is, then institute a new protocol. Create a protocol that says when we do discussions, we're going to break into smaller groups and they have to rotate every time. Or when we do discussions, you cannot ask a question or speak to the same person you've already spoken to until you speak to somebody else, right? That's actually a rule in the Japanese game of Go. You cannot take a piece and change the board so that it would look exactly as it did before this turn. So you always have to do something that looks different on the board, right? And so I think something to think about that way for a classroom is, Dave, I know you're new to class, but you need to be the first one to speak to Sarah. And Sarah, once Dave speaks to you, you've got to speak to John. Like, it's not rocket science here, and it doesn't need to necessarily even be as trite as that. But if you identify an issue, just create a protocol. You don't have to write a treatise. You don't have to nail theses to a wall. You don't have to call students out either. You just say, Josh is over here like, I got my hammer and nails ready.
I'm fine.
Okay?
I'm good. I'm good with nailing treaties.
Yeah.
Treatise?
Treatises?
Yeah, let's leave this conversation. We're embarrassing.
So, I don't know. I think Equity Maps, great tool. I think it's free or really cheap on the Apple iPad. Like, you only need to buy one app of it too. It's not a hard tool to integrate.
Download looks free on there. I'm trying to, all of our prep guys, we did so great.
I've looked into it like years ago. It's like one guy who made the app. It's really useful. I know some teams who have used it to do some research. So what my biggest encouragement to you is, consider what it could do for your classroom and helping you identify any sort of unconscious bias or selection bias that's at play, and identify and reflect on ways you can improve your classroom experience. Make your classroom more available, more equitable to all your students. I think
pricing, just real quick for those who are curious, because it's amazing what happens when you click on a FAQ help section on their website. It would have been really great for us to do that ahead of time. Go High Tech Podcast. The pricing. They don't have any subscriptions or reoccurring fees. It's just payment for the app download.
Cool.
So it looks like it's like $199. I think you download, and then there's a standard version for $199 that allows up to like 20 participants, and then it looks like it's like $8.99 to go up to like 40 people. And again, those participants are the people we're talking about in these meetings that you're tracking. So I think again, that's not bad for an app like this. I mean, again, it's not there's not a ton of features.
It's a one-time fee.
It's a one-time fee. It's not a subscription fee. And again, this is not something this isn't some complicated app or some of the bigger apps that we've talked about where there's a lot of features. It has a very focused intention, but I think an intention that's really universal across a lot of different courses and classrooms for use. And so, again, I think it's like, to your point, Will, it's just like we've talked about this in a couple episodes before, but the amount of instructors who I think just get annoyed at the students who don't participate more. And they're just like, oh, your grade's lower. And it's like, there's actually reasons for sometimes why people don't participate. It might actually be that your classroom's not welcoming certain types of people to respond.
Absolutely.
And so let's not only criticize the student, let's take a second to use a tool like Equity Maps and actually evaluate how conversation is going and start to change our techniques to foster better, inclusive conversations within the classroom so that we can get that diversity of voices inside our classroom. Yeah. So,
well, I just love it. I think this is something that is not only a thing that's happening in our society to this time, but it's something that we should care deeply about as we relate to one another. And as I said before, the classroom should be a space where we can get to do things safely. And so if our students are feeling unsafe or uncomfortable in the classroom, we know that at the very least they have less motivation to act and they have less motivation to learn, but altogether it's not as good of a space for them to be in, and we want to create the optimal space for learning. So that's our ideas today about how you might accomplish it.
How you might. So thanks guys joining us another week. Check out Equity Maps. If you listen to this episode and you have other ideas for creating an inclusive classroom, we meant it, like actually reach out to us. We're going to start mentioning this more and more, but we do have social media things.
Absolutely.
We aren't ancient.
Our email inbox is inbox@hightechpod.us, right? Inbox at
that goes
our
to
website.
our wonderful assistant. Us.
No,
us. No. So you can message us there or hit us up on Twitter at High Tech Podcast.
High Tech Podcast.
Right? Yeah. Sorry, I realized I was like I haven't looked at our mention for a while. I should know that off the top of my head. I don't. So at High Tech Podcast, check us out on Twitter. So we drop a lot of information about our episodes, but feel free to mention us or DM us on Twitter, and we'd be happy to talk with you guys about other ideas. I'm sure there's more that we could talk about later on about this conversation. So, but either way, we appreciate you joining us on this initial journey into an inclusive classroom, and how we can harness some technology to actually aid us in doing that in our classrooms. So appreciate it again, guys, and see ya.
See ya.